The morning began with a silence so unnatural it felt manufactured, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The house, usually alive with the faint hum of distant traffic and early birds, sat inside a cocoon of stillness that pressed against the walls like an invisible weight. Something was wrong. The air carried it. The ground carried it. Even the faint shift of sunlight felt distorted, like the day itself was warning of a disturbance that had arrived before dawn. The moment the front door opened, the truth revealed itself in a way no one would ever expect. A massive trench, deep and raw like a fresh wound carved by hostile hands, encircled the entire property. The soil lay piled in jagged mounds, still damp from the night air, showing signs of being dug in haste, yet with enough precision to isolate the house like a trapped animal. The trench wasn't just a line in the earth, it was a message. A threat without words. A silent barricade meant to corner, shame, and warn. The early sun cast long, sharp shadows across the uneven edges, making the cut look even deeper. It had appeared overnight, an impossible undertaking for any ordinary neighbor. But this neighborhood was governed by an HOA that carried its own silent reputation, one whispered about by those who had lived through its subtle punishments and coded moves. The trench was the kind of act that spoke to a deeper agenda, the kind of cruelty disguised behind policies, meetings, and selective enforcement that always seemed to fall upon the same type of homeowner. Footprints surrounded the perimeter, chaotic yet deliberate, like a team had moved in darkness with practiced hands and concealed tools. Some prints were wider, heavier. Others were lighter, almost careful. They told the story of multiple people working under the same order. And they had come with a purpose, one designed to intimidate. The marks of tire tracks barely visible across the grass hinted at equipment being quietly rolled in under the cover of night. The HOA had done something like this before, small acts, quiet acts, but never anything on this scale. Nothing this bold. Nothing this hostile. But what the perpetrators didn't know, the part that would unravel everything, was hidden inside the home itself. A network of cameras, invisible in daylight, positioned with meticulous intention, watched everything. Cameras tucked beneath eaves, inside decorative fixtures, and even at angles impossible to detect. Cameras installed not out of paranoia, but out of necessity, because discrimination didn't always come loudly. Sometimes it crawled, slow and silent, through the cracks of neighborhoods that pretended to be perfect. And the footage captured in the dead of night would expose every masked intention, every step taken around the house, every shovel hitting the ground, every whisper exchanged in the dark. The truth was already saved, backed up, and waiting for the moment it would turn their quiet cruelty into undeniable evidence. HOA thought the homeowner would wake up to a trap, cornered, powerless. Instead, they unknowingly walked directly into a record of their own downfall. The trench was not the beginning of the story. It was merely the spark. The first tear in a curtain hiding deeper lies, buried resentment, and racial bias woven into the very soil of this neighborhood. And once uncovered, none of them would be able to bury it again. Hit subscribe. Watch till the end. The house had always stood like a quiet witness on the edge of the neighborhood, a modest structure surrounded by tall pines that whispered whenever the wind shifted. It wasn't grand, but it carried history, years of effort, sacrifice, and resilience layered into every beam and nail. The land around it had once felt open and welcoming, a sanctuary carved out of a place that didn't always welcome those who didn't mirror its majority. The neighborhood itself moved with a curated calmness, a silence built on rules, glances, and unspoken expectations. The manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, and perfectly aligned hedges projected a picture-perfect world, but beneath that surface ran a quiet current of exclusion. It existed in the way people paused when passing my home, the way their eyes lingered a second too long, as if questioning what didn't fit. It existed in the meetings I was never informed about, the notices that conveniently missed my mailbox, and the decisions made on my behalf without my presence. Despite the undertones, the house remained a place where I could breathe, where the walls held steady against the subtle hostility beyond the property line. The soil beneath it had been tilled by my own hands, shaped over years of work. I had chosen this home not because I was welcome, but because I believed I had the right to belong where I chose to stand. Yet, over time, the air had grown heavier around the neighborhood. Small signs of tension appeared like cracks under pressure, vehicles slowing as they passed, unfamiliar faces appearing too often, and the faint sense that decisions were being made far from my sight. Something had been building, quietly, deliberately, just out of view. And now, the trench outside proved that whatever had been brewing had finally ruptured into action. The trench became more than a violation. It became a line dividing the world I knew from the reality that had quietly grown around me. As I stepped outside, the soil's raw scent clung to the morning air, heavy and unsettled. The ground that had once supported my steps now felt carved apart, disturbed by hands that had worked without hesitation or fear of consequence. The marks left by machinery dug deeper into my thoughts than the trench did into the earth. The neighborhood stirred slowly, but its stillness held a curious tension. Curtains shifted, shadows paused behind frosted glass, and figures moved with the keen awareness of people who knew more than they wanted to admit. Their silence felt rehearsed, as if the trench had been a performance meant to send a message to everyone watching, and even more, a warning meant for me alone. Yet no one stepped forward. No one acknowledged what had happened. Their stillness was its own confession. As I walked the perimeter of the cut, the truth of its scale became clearer. This was not a simple act of vandalism, it was an operation. The edges were too clean, the depth too uniform, and the tracks too heavy to belong to anything but industrial equipment. The motives behind it reached beyond petty hostility. Something coordinated had taken place in the dark, something planned with the confidence of people who believed their actions would remain unseen. But they hadn't remained unseen. My hidden cameras, small, silent and carefully placed, had captured the entire event. Every movement, every vehicle, every person. The footage revealed a group moving with precision, illuminated only by the dim glow of equipment lights. Their body language carried intention, not confusion or hesitation. They worked with a purpose shaped long before the machines arrived. There was no surprise on their faces, no uncertainty in their motions. They carved the trench as if executing an order. As I watched the recordings, a cold realization settled over me like a shadow stretching across the ground. The trench wasn't meant to damage the property. It was meant to isolate it. To isolate me. The deeper truth was woven into the timing, the precision, and the silent approval of the community around me. Something had been unfolding far longer than I had realized. And the trench was only the beginning of what they were prepared to do. The weight of the recordings pressed against my chest long after the final frame ended. The reality captured in those silent hours revealed a truth more disturbing than the trench itself. What I had believed to be an isolated act of hostility was part of a calculated pattern, a strategy woven beneath years of subtle exclusion and quiet resistance. The trench was simply the first act brought into the light. As the day progressed, the neighborhood's atmosphere shifted. Movements became more deliberate, glances more synchronized, as though a silent signal had gone out alerting everyone that the operation was complete. The ease with which they resumed their routines created an almost surreal contrast to the destruction surrounding my home. Their normalcy felt staged, a collective attempt to bury the evidence under routine. But beneath the rhythm of their day-to-day movements, a deeper truth pulsed. They believed they had already won. Yet they hadn't accounted for the one thing they couldn't control, what my cameras had seen. As I reviewed the footage again, small details sharpened into clarity. Vehicles positioned at strategic angles to shield the work from public view. Individuals stationed on the street corners acting as watchers. Coordinated gestures signaling when to move, when to pause, when to dig deeper. This wasn't improvisation, it was choreography. Something orchestrated with precision and confidence, something backed by authority that believed itself untouchable. But the most chilling moment came near the end of the recording. When the trench had been completed and the machines powered down, the group didn't disperse immediately. They circled the perimeter of my home, inspecting their own work with a sense of accomplishment. Their posture carried certainty that I would wake isolated, powerless, and afraid. Certainty that no one outside their circle would help, intervene, or question what had been done. Certainty that this was the final step in pushing me out. Their faces showed no concern, no hesitation, only the quiet satisfaction of people who believed they had drawn a boundary that could not be crossed. But they were wrong. Because the truth they had tried to bury beneath the soil now lived in the recordings I held, evidence that would expose not only the act, but the system of silent understanding that had enabled it. The moment they stepped away from the trench believing their work was complete was the moment the balance shifted. They had carved a circle meant to isolate me. Instead, they had trapped themselves inside the evidence of their own intentions. The trench remained for days, a raw wound carved into the earth, visible to anyone who passed. Its presence transformed the property into an island, cut off, exposed, and unmistakably targeted. Yet the severance it created did something the group had not intended. It drew eyes. Not just from those who supported the silent hostility, but from those who had remained indifferent until the evidence became impossible to ignore. The footage began to move quietly, passed to the people who needed to see it most. Each frame peeled away the neighborhood's facade, revealing a pattern long disguised as protocol and procedure. The coordinated movements, the industrial precision, the unspoken unity behind every action, they all painted a portrait too clear to dismiss. Even those who had once stayed quiet began to feel the weight of what the truth exposed. The boundary the group had drawn around my home had unintentionally outlined their own wrongdoing. Investigations followed, slow at first but increasingly persistent as the evidence continued to speak louder than the neighborhood's practiced silence. The cameras that had watched in the dark now illuminated a network of complicity, individuals who had acted under the belief that no one would question them, organizations that had assumed their authority would never be challenged, and a mentality that had thrived on pushing out those who didn't fit the pattern they wanted to maintain. The trench became more than an act of intimidation, it became a landmark of accountability. Day by day, the community's mask cracked. The hidden motives, the years of exclusion, and the calculated hostility that had grown in the shadows now stood exposed under a light no one could dim. And as the truth continued to circulate, the house, my house, stood firm. Not as a victim, but as a witness that refused to be silenced. Its walls had endured the quiet hostility of the past and now bore witness to the unraveling of the system that had sought to remove it. In the end, the trench they dug around me became the line that separated truth from pretense, exposure from secrecy, and justice from the quiet comforts of complicity. A line that asked a simple question to anyone watching.